Okay. Something I sort of forgot to go over, by the way, is that the edited copy is now going to have these, like, bullet bursts from, like, the character at the top now. And this is actually something that, like, I'm basically sort of, like, recently sort of adding to, like, this story. And it's basically to sort of, like, expound on the fact that basically, like, for example, Faye's basically from a humble background, which is basically much opposed to, like, everyone else. And other little tidbits that basically sort of, like, describe the, like, sort of background of the story. Like, these have Elvis-style coverings. Why are they basically in, like, Ziggurat lands? Like, for what purpose basically are they here? There's something, like, wrong with this book. This is not, like, an ordinary book. There's something wrong with it. And, we also get, like, a sort of clue here that basically, it looks like, there's a broken magical security ward here. So, these have been stolen. And it seems like it's been nullified by anti-magic forces. And the whole idea basically for, like, these little blurbs is basically sort of like, give you an idea of, like, what's basically going on with, like, these books. I'll note, by the way, for, like, book 5, by the way, I also had, like, the idea of, like, possibly, like, throwing in, like, a blurb for each of the chapters so you basically go around finding them. But I decided to sort of, like, just keep it simple and just have, like, one as a start. And one, like, sort of one at the end. Alright, so I just want to basically, like, sort of note that because it's basically something I think is, like, an interesting idea basically sort of, like, had to, like, include the story now. So I'm basically editing it. Alright, I'm not going to basically go over, like, explain, like, why the Heart of Gloom is basically, like, in the story. Essentially, I've already basically, like, noted that basically I touched on it to basically sort of explain, like, its origin and stuff like that. So let's just skip that. But I will note that basically, like, something I changed here. I wanted to sort of, like, emphasize the fact that basically it was at this point that, like, Faye gets cursed. And on top of the fact that she basically gets cursed, she basically, like, starts to actually decide, like, to do stuff because of her cursed power basically pushing her. So she's basically being influenced by, like, her affliction now, and she doesn't even know it. And that's basically the whole Harvest, like, story right here, is that, like, this is about, like, a cursed, like, individual who's basically running around Maj'Eyal because her curse is basically making her run around Maj'Eyal. And this is in, like, stark contrast to, like, the rest of Valoran who don't run around Maj'Eyal. Alright, so, I'll note that basically, like, something to keep in mind, by the way. One of the reasons we basically have, like, this, like, little expert about the two wolves to basically attack Faye here, it's not only just to sort of, like, examine the fact that basically she's capable of, like, fighting, but it's also to sort of examine how, like, how tough she basically is. Essentially, there's, like, this man who's basically, like, dealing with, like, rogue animals, and he's basically having a hard time, and he's basically obviously a military, like, officer. And then we have Faye here, who basically is, like, unarmed, doesn't have any weapon on her, or armor. And she's, like, walks up and basically goes, whump, and, like, makes the two wolves run off, like, without much issue. And it's both basically, I guess, they sort of, like, show off the fact that, like, she is capable of, like, being, like, quick combat ready. And it's basically sort of, like, foretelling of things basically to come. And I realize that it's not, like, enough basically to sort of, like, say that she's basically, like, fully combat ready, but it's basically enough to sort of show off that, like, she's no pushover eater. Now, I'll note that, one of the things basically I want to do with, like, this story is basically sort of examine, like, elements of the game itself that we actually play. And, one of the things I basically wanted to sort of cover here is, like, why there's basically, like, no infusion shop basically in Elvia. And I figure, like, it'd be nice to, like, sort of have like, sort of lore idea around it, where, like, the Floran are obviously averse to the arcane, but the Shulan are obviously averse to the, to, like, things in nature as well. And it made for, like, a really sort of, like, interesting sort of dynamic between, like, the two, like, elves. And we don't really get to see it in the lore, but, whatever, they're basically there as well. And that's the whole idea basically behind, like, where this basically comes from, by the way. I'm not basically like, for like the Florin, because they don't have like a sort of ruin shop. That's where I basically get the idea from like, um, the chapter 4 medical treatment, where like, Fay basically sees like ruins for the first time. And like, it's like her first time seeing like, ruins or magic, because she's a backwater hick in the Florin Forest. She never sees this sort of stuff. This is like not so. This is like new to her and stuff like that. So yeah. Also note, by the way, like I basically have like her showing off her infusion knowledge here. This is actually something I never really touched on just yet, but I'll note that Faye's probably more like gifted with like infusions than like the Shaloran healers basically here are. And it sort of like goes to like the idea that basically, even though these guys are trained healers, they don't usually use infusions to sort of heal people. They use like runes and stuff like that, and and magic spells basically as well. And it sort of like goes to the point that like when basically treating people, you have to have like experience basically do it. And a really good example is actually a recent example of the Japanese like former prime minister got shot recently in like Japan. Basically there's like a speech that this like former prime minister of Japan was basically giving, and a rogue individual who didn't like his policies made like a homemade shotgun, walked up to his back and basically shot him in the back with it. And basically like the former prime minister died. But basically when he's being treated, the first aid like that's basically done to him, it was not done properly. And it's a very like sort of good example where like if you don't have like experience basically treating something, you're going to do it wrong. And the Japanese don't commonly treat gunshot wounds, so they did it wrong. That's just how it went. And he probably would have still died, but I mean, it basically goes to show that like basically Faye has like a lot of experience with infusions because she deals with infusions. She has to make her own in like the forest. She doesn't have like the ability to like go to a healer and like in Shatur basically. So she has to basically like make do what she will. And it's basically like something different towards the Stroller here, who basically don't really have that sort of benefit here. Like they have to basically go from like essentially training they obviously basically have, but training don't actually really use is the idea. Alright, so now I'll note that basically when I get down to like general like Erwin Guil here, we basically explain like the spell blades and stuff like that. But when we basically get to like chapter 6, we start to learn that like we stop basically sending people out to like send aid and stuff like that, because there's issues basically going on. And it seems like there's some bad actors basically out there who are basically targeting the Shalor. And of course these are like the Ziggurat basically, they don't know it just yet, but they're out there. And I want to basically sort of highlight this basically right now. The thing about like the Ziggurat being like sort of active right away, this sort of like corresponds to the idea I basically sort of have in my head, where the Ziggurat basically actually knew about the spell blaze, and like it's being like an action basically be taken. And I didn't really like, sort of go into it, but it's very possible that like perhaps the Ziggurat may have sabotaged the spell blaze without like the Shalor basically knowing. Or it could be like another idea where like perhaps the Ziggurat basically like they knew about it, and as soon as it basically failed, they basically like took advantage of it basically immediately, which is like probably like the heck end most people basically have. But either way, basically the Ziggurat basically highly knowledgeable of like what was basically going on, and they're able to take advantage of it like regardless. And that's basically what chapter 6 basically sort of started hinting on basically right here. Now, I'm not basically for like the first like book here. There's lots of lore that basically sort of like corresponds to like the different parts of like what's basically already in Maj'Eyal. I'll note, for example, at the Kornak territories, there used to be like some Kornak basically to like the west of like that mountain range and the western side of like Maj'Eyal. In like our bits of lore, and that's basically why the Kornak basically are right there, like coming down to actually attack him. You actually learn about it in like the the Chronicles of the Spellblaze basically. And there's other stuff like that as well, where like when basically we're going through like the first chapter here, we have like Fay basically coming across like the battlefield of, like the the Shoreline and the Orcs, where basically like Linali basically fell for the first time and was rescued by like Guil. And this is basically sort of like thing to note about book 1. Book 1 is basically very much heavily based in like the other lore, whereas the following like books basically they were still like based in the lore, but less and less so. Book 2, for example, was basically like, not really based on like any specific like events that are happening, as like, we didn't really have anything really discussing like the Nargles. But we did have like, some ideas from like the Ziggurat from what they basically sort of did. And I was able to sort of like, tie that basically into like, what's basically happening at this time in like the Nargle Kingdom. So I'll note that one of the ways we basically sort of did that was like, starting out right from here, we basically have the refugees basically popping in. And I'll note basically, of course, like, this is where we take like Durf basically from like, the starting position for like humans and halflings. Durf, of course, is basically just like, humble little town. And has like both humans and halflings basically in it. And one of the things is like, where does basically sort of come from that we basically had like humans and halflings living together is like, over here. And I want to basically sort of like have an idea where like, the Nargles were actually being benevolent and basically taking the refugees around them. So they're taking like the Kornax, they're taking like the dwarves that happen to be nearby, and other halflings that basically came from summons nearby too. And part of the reason for like doing this is that basically sort of explains like that like Maj'Eyal is basically a very like open place for like the other races. The floor might be like sort of like restricted to where they basically are, and the shore are basically restricted to where they are because reasons. Both basically like FMAC as well as like they have to be like restricted because everyone's trying to kill them. But I wanted to basically sort of like sort of show that basically the other races like the dwarves, the humans, the halflings, they were basically all like sort of congregating like meeting with each other quite a bit. And technically so were the ogres too, but also they get sort of restricted. They just get restricted like during the story is what basically happens for them. All right, so I'll note that when we get to like chapter 2, by the way. This is where we actually really get to see like how informed the Ziggurat basically sort of are. And I want to basically sort of like emphasize the fact that like this guy basically knows about like what's basically happening with the spellblades and stuff like that. And something actually changed here, by the way. I actually changed this so this guy was actually like saying like indeed, or so I've been told by my friend, the one who came by just now actually. Part of the reason for like throwing this basically in here so it's basically show off like this is not like the higher rank guy right here, this guy, the messenger. But it also basically shows off that like the Ziggurat basically actually know quite a bit about like what happened with the spellblades. And I'll note by the way as well, I actually changed this so like when we get to like chapter 4 that like he actually says like spellblades in his speech. Like yes, it says in a fiasco that name is spellblades. And it's basically for his purpose to sort of like essentially exercise the fact that basically Ziggurat basically know about the spellblades, and they're actually using it as like a tool to sort of like rally up people against the the Shalorn and against like Bastion and everything else like that. Also know as well, by the way, if you maybe like wonder like why basically like the Ziggurat basically might be attacking Fay, it is because like this guy sort of like knows the fact that basically like something's basically wrong here with like this floor. This one I throw is basically in here. Basically, like this, like line right here is like the messenger actually realizing there's actually something wrong here because, like you are a fellow defender of nature, right? All right, so now I'll note basically like chapter 3, 4, and 5. This is actually something to note about this lore. I want to basically sort of like highlight like aspects of the lore that like aspects of the game rather that are basically not in the lore just yet. And one of the things that are like never really touched on was like the idea of like using psionics to basically do stuff. And Blazing like Mass is basically our first example of like psionics being used to sort of like manipulate people. We basically see like a film manipulation here where like people basically go off to attack the market. Then we get down to like despicable atrocities where we actually see them successfully manipulate people to actually like carry out their like sort of activities they basically want to, the Ziggurat. And then in psionic trickery, we actually see like the introduction to the psionic slaver, who of course basically tries to manipulate Fay and fails, but we see basically sort of in action. And the whole idea basically like introducing like the psionics and like the curse and everything else in this like this entire like lore piece is basically to highlight these like aspects that haven't really been like shown in the lore before. And it's very possible this could have been like changed to be like sort of like a curse type of thing, but I think it basically works a lot better to actually have psionics happening right here, so hooray for that, I guess. Now, I'll note with the psionic slaver right here, this could also be a template for like an idea of like a class perhaps as well. Though, I'll note that this guy right here is actually based on a solstice right here. And it should be pretty obvious, like, where I basically get the inspiration from. Basically, it's got, like, a faceless humanoid here, basically, so... Yeah, basically, you can see, like, down here. And basically, the idea of, like, having this, like, sort of, like, thought form, basically, right here. Essentially, the Sonic Slaver basically uses, like, the psychic is basically, like, sort of generated from, like, their inner thoughts. Basically, they, like, make the thought form basically take on the appearance of something they basically know, like an inner demon type of thing. And, I thought it was, like, a sort of neat idea, basically sort of showing, like, how, like, manipulative, like, the Sonics can basically be. Now, I didn't really actually notice, by the way, did I actually, like, change, like, something to, like, be different? Another one basically comes to, like, the, like, the messenger here. One thing that actually changed about this guy is I actually made it so, like, he actually reveals his light blue eyes right up here. And it's worth knowing that basically if I go down to, like, the chapter 5 for, like, book 2 here, you'll notice it actually changed to, like, grayish eyes. Now, it's worth knowing that basically, like, this is a higher, but the messenger here basically, like, the Sonic obviously, like, knows him, but he doesn't know of him completely. So basically, he makes a mistake basically here, and it's like, these little mistakes that basically, like, Face picks up on, and she actually, like, realizes, like, oh, this is a fake. And I want to basically, like, sort of like highlight the fact that basically, how, like, basically sort of like a mental state sort of works basically, like actually see through the illusion that this way. Now, let's see here. I've already basically sort of highlighted this basically, like, in the Spellhunter's Guide, basically, they, like, don't, like, sort of, like, suggest that fire be used to sort of, like, kill spellcasters because they can teleport away. But I always found that to be sort of, like, a really bad piece of, like, lore basically in the game, like, for, like, part of the Spellhunter's Guide. Just for a simple fact that basically the antimatter actually have, like, the ability to sort of scream at people and, like, knock off their ability basically to, like, cast stuff. And basically just like a sort of idea basically we have here. Basically, if, like, the mace actually teleport away, then he's looking for basically know for sure that basically those are, like, spellcasters, and they can just, like, try and hunt them down and kill them basically. But here's like, the thing about this, like, this, like, chapter here. I think, like, the idea of, like, having, like, the spellcasters be burned here. The thing about it is that, like, the Zingers are obviously very knowledgeable of the fact that the fire can be, like, a very, like, good message to basically send to people. Because basically, like, very, like, prolific, they can actually use it. And you can actually basically, like, sort of, like, make demonstrations with fire that, like, are really spectacular, which is what they basically did. So I think, like, for a Zinger, that, like, it may not be, like, the most, like, surefire way basically of killing a spellcaster, but for them it's probably the most, like, prominent way of it basically doing it, because it has, like, the ability to, like, sort of show the masses basically what's going on. And I think, like, before, like, the Age of Pyre, where, like, we basically have Gargoyle running around, this would probably be, like, their prominent choice basically to actually use to actually, like, promote their activities basically, shall we say. That's basically how I see, like, the use of fire basically and, like, killing spellcasters. It may be perhaps, like not the most ideal way of basically doing it, but it's still, like, a spectacular way of basically doing it, which is, like, great for, like, propaganda purposes. Now, along with, like, the fact that basically how, like, a psionic, like, slaver, I also basically introduced the brawler basically with, like, the halfling here. And another reason I basically introduced the brawler is because, like, we didn't really have, like, in the lore, like, a brawler just yet. And it's, like, our first real introduction basically to one. And it's worth knowing that basically, like, this brawler here, basically, like, attacks Fay at some point. And I just want to highlight this right here, just like, these few sentences right here. This is, like, the second sort of instance I basically have of, like, Fay basically, like, showing off her combat prowess. I'll note that basically in, like, the first book, we used to have her fight those wolves, but here we used to have the halfling basically, like, connector of, like, a body punch and an uppercut. And the idea here is basically, like, to sort of show off, like, how powerful Fay basically is taking blows. And this is going to be in contrast to, like, book 3, where, like, essentially we'll have, like, the ogres in, like, chapter 4, I believe it is, at the end. And right here, basically, in those like these two paragraphs, basically here, we have basically a halfling basically battling against the ogres, so basically like come out to basically attack him. So we basically see like the halfling's basically fully aware of capable of like throwing off like an ogre basically into like a pool of lava. When like an ogre basically tries to like directly attack him, he basically simply crouches and attacks like once to the ogre's stomach before jumping up to land a devastating kick. And the whole idea basically for like doing this is basically sort of demonstrate that like compared to like the ogres, Fay's basically able to take like more hits than like the ogres versus like this halfling. And this can be like in contrast to the fact that basically like she's also cursed. So not only is the halfling basically not able to like take her on like when she's basically not like have a gloom field basically out. When it basically suffers from the gloom and has like reduced damage, then like he's gonna be doing even less damage to like Fay. So she can basically take those hits a lot easier than like these ogres basically can. And that's basically part of the reason I basically have it like in spare where like she takes those like hits from like the halfling basically here. Alright, so that's basically like the first like sort of first two books basically covered here. There's only a little bit more basically to cover here, so I'll not basically in like book 3 basically highlight the Maj'Eyal Plains basically again. And I'll basically sort of like explain this a little bit like right now. But essentially the idea of like the Maj'Eyal Plains and like all the lands being pushed up right here. That's basically why the sun showing is basically sort of like lava infested like sort of like terrain right now, because essentially like that's like the earth basically erupting in like this like area here. And that's basically all the molten lava and stuff like that from like under like northern lands basically like seeping back out into the ocean from this point. All around basically Maj'Eyal Plains, or where we used to be. And that's basically why like everything's like burnt and like lifeless and everything else in this area, is because even though like perhaps like the spellblades perhaps didn't like directly basically go through like the center of the continent, it is sort of like run around it. Alright, so I'll note that with the fleeing ogres, by the way, this is actually a really good example where like I wasn't really like intending to actually make the Krog basically like this story right here, but it really served as a good sort of like idea of like what would actually happen to the ogres during the spell hunt when this was basically happening with like the Ziggurat, I guess. The thing about the Ziggurat is that like they're basically sort of highlighted as being like anti-magic and like hating of like magic casters, but I thought it'd be like a more interesting idea of like they at least had like some amount of sympathy, because they basically saw that in like the story of My Salvation, where they won't necessarily like just kill like both people who are perhaps like innocent, like they might be foolishly doing something, but they aren't like completely like heartless and stuff like that. That's what the idea is basically going on here. And even though like they could commit genocide, it basically shows that the Ziggurat aren't basically a sort of like faction that like genocides off in their race, and they actually at least try to actually save like the ogres and like turn into like the Krog basically as a result of like, their actions right here. Now, I'll note that with the ogres in the lore here, by the way, part of the reason I basically sort of included them is because we didn't really have anything written basically about the ogres, or like how they basically got down to Elviat basically as well. And basically like I included them right here to sort of like highlight this fact, like where are they basically going, and like how do they basically get from like point A to point B, so to speak. And a lot of us like I basically wrote here for like the ogres to basically sort of like show off like what they're basically sort of like, since we didn't really have any lore about them. And we see like in like book 4 eventually I'll talk about like their eating habits and stuff like that, and like I'll like pull apart like some ideas like the internment camp where like they used to have to sleep in beds and such. And then we get to like the battle down here. Now I'll note that basically with like the ogres here, they are basically of course using ruins that basically no longer exist in the game, like the lightning ruin and like the vision ruin. And we actually saw basically like both like chapter 2 and like chapter 3 of like the vision ruin. And I'll note basically like I guess like it's, like in some ways it's kind of like unfortunate basically that those are basically taken out of the game, but at the same time like those like pieces of like of like history of like the game, I think it's also really good to sort of include them as well, because you can actually see like what the ogres are sort of like when they actually use them like those like items basically properly. Anyhow, I'm not basically in regards to like this battle here and like the Dark Resolve and like hateful wrath. Something I want to basically include in like book 3 is basically sort of like a highlight of like what battles actually really like basically in the story. And that's basically why just like, you know, these like chapters here basically sort of heavily correspond to like, you know, what the Curse class and Brawler class and like, you know, runes can basically do. The description basically here is like, you know, different from like the rest of the lore in the game, because the rest of the lore sort of has glosses over combat, but here we actually see like, you know, it in like, you know, sort of direct like, you know, telling basis, so to speak. We actually see like, you know, each attack basically being like done and each taunt being used. Like for example, when I basically get down to like, you know, fighting the halfling down here, we basically see like, you know, I basically have where like, you know, Faye's basically like, you know, sailing underground one moment before like, she basically blindsides the halfling the next. And we also see like other things like, you know, friends being used. We see like, you know, her like her 4th tier talent for like knocking away blows with her like her hand. It would be like a 30% increase with her shield if you basically had that on, but you get the idea, sort of idea. Repel. Yeah, that's basically the skill. Repel. So if you actually demonstrate she has a repel on, she probably has like a gloom on basically during this like, you know, events basically of this right here. And it's not really basically sort of like stated, but you know, you get this sort of idea of like, you know, back and forth like what's basically sort of happening in this battle. Now, to sort of like, you know, touch on something as well, just sort of like, you know, go over it by the way. One of the reasons I basically sort of like, you know, changed all the text here to be like, you know, Comic Sans as opposed to like, you know, Arial. First is because like, you know, Comic Sans basically has like a very like different style basically to it. But it's also because like, you know, Faye's basically not in her right mind basically when she's basically writing out like, you know, this part like the text right here. And I'll note basically like, you know, when I'm looking at the Curse of Affliction, I see it like a little bit differently from like, you know, being like a sort of like, you know, natural disease that people might have, I guess. The thing about like, you know, Faye's like sort of like, you know, affliction here is that basically sort of like, you know, it's sort of like kind of like, you know, the light and dark sides forces of like, you know, forces of like Star Wars, I guess we'll say. And I'm not basically like, you know, the Force basically for like Star Wars. The light side is basically very much like, you know, this sort of peaceful like, you know, symbiotic sort of like nature between like, you know, Force user and like, you know, the Force. And then like you have the Dark Force, which is basically, you know, manipulating like, you know, the Force basically as like the user. And I sort of like took the idea and like, you know, put it on its head here, where like, you know, essentially like, you know, the affliction here is basically happening to Faye. It's very much like a dark side of the Force, like, you know, in a sort of Star Wars context. But instead of like, you know, the user manipulating the Force, it's the Force that's actually manipulating the user itself. And you're actually seeing like, you know, how it's basically manipulating her to be like, you know, more like, you know, chaotic, more like, you know, kill happy, I guess we'll say. There's all that. Alright, so basically once we get down here, we basically see like, you know, Faye basically take the ores away and like we take them to Elvia. Alright, well, there's a little bit more to add, I guess, but I'm just going to stop the recording one moment and we'll get to it.